Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk. Hello and welcome back to the Prospect podcast, where we unpack the big ideas and trends in politics, arts and society. I'm Ellen Halliday.
And I'm Alona Ferber.
And today we'll be hearing about the dark side of the internet, the incel movement, and whether there's a crisis in masculinity. Emily Lawford, who's commissioning editor at Prospect, met with men's rights activists offline and wrote the Incel Trap, a really in-depth bit of reporting that you have done for the latest issue of Prospect magazine. The piece is titled The Incel Trap. And for that piece, you decided to look into kind of the alienation of young men and then their subsequent radicalization online in a group that you talk about as being called kind of the manosphere. Can you kind of briefly explain what the manosphere is, how it relates to this other concept of incels that you also talk about, and who basically these men were and are that you were interested in looking into?
Thank you. So the manosphere is a very unwieldy group of men on the internet who talk about men's issues. Not everyone in the manosphere is necessarily toxic. Some of them dealing with, men's issues, paternity rights, things like that, men's mental health. But a lot of the manosphere, and it's what it's got its reputation for, is being incredibly toxic because men, and there's lots and lots of different subgroups and splinter groups, but a characterizing trait is misogyny, is this sort of belief that men are victimized because they are men by women. And they meet on Reddit, but other sites as well, like what was 4chan and all kinds of sites like that. And they complain and they argue and they breed a lot of this stuff that then these ideas about women controlling society, about men's rights. And there's different movements. There's the trad movement, which is more about how women should be like housewives in a home and go back to sort of 1950s values. And there's other groups. One of the men I spoke to was we used to be in the men going their own way movement, which was more about just get away from women completely. We as a society don't need women. We should just ignore them and accept not having sex. So there's loads and loads of different strains within it. But the characterizing trait, I would say, is misogyny.
Yeah. And I mean, when you started looking into this kind of group and this concept of the manosphere, we talked a bit about Laura Bates's book, Men Who Hate Women. What kind of work has been done before in kind of understanding who these people are as well, and why they come together online?
Yeah, I found Laura Bates's book really interesting and really helpful because she did a lot of looking at the different groups and she identifying different ones. She's the main person I can think of who really looked into defining how this started. Basically as soon as the internet started, when these men started. The concept of incel, which is involuntary celibate, was actually a black woman came up with it. She's an academic who was talking about people who are genuinely sexually marginalised and cut out from society, which is not at all to say that, men can't experience that as well. They absolutely can. But it's become this, because of the internet, it's kind of changed into this word that it's resentment that I have a total right to sex, and if I'm not given it, that's someone else's problem.
So what kind of people did you find on these forums online? Like what motivated these men to sort of spend a lot of their time on the internet writing about how much they hate women?
Yeah, when I met them, I felt quite sorry for them, to be honest, because I really did see how lonely they were. The last man I spoke to, less so, but the first two, the first two I met up with, I was very much immediately struck by their loneliness. Both told me they didn't speak to many people in the day. They didn't have a lot of friends. They seemed quite naturally outsiders, a little bit awkward. And yeah, and they were both quite open about not speaking to a lot of people and feeling lonely and just being drawn into internet and gaming and going on sites and finding a sort of solidarity there. So I think a lot of it was having genuine grievances with and they both had really hard upbringings. They both grew up in care and they both had very difficult childhoods. So I genuinely felt really sorry for them, and I could understand why they have legitimate grievances with society, that things haven't gone for them maybe as they'd want, and they don't have the people maybe they would want. But they'd completely identified the wrong enemy, the wrong problem for this. They think
some of your conversations with them were quite challenging because whilst, as you say, you were seeking to kind of understand who they were as people, and you saw their loneliness. Some of the things that they said, they expressed views that were strongly misogynistic, and in other contexts might make women feel unsafe. Certainly expressed a sort of clear misogyny, really. So those conversations that you had with them were quite difficult nonetheless, weren't they?
Yeah, it's quite difficult when you're talking with someone and trying to understand them, and then they come out with calling women whores or something, and you're like, you don't really know what to say at that point. Dan was, well, I called him Dan in the piece, his real name's not Dan, was going on about how it's so awful when women wear makeup, and I said, I'm wearing makeup right now, and he then got a bit embarrassed, but it felt like weird, like you've just completely forgotten what women are like because you've got this woman in your head that you think is a whore who's wearing makeup, and you just haven't put that theory to any woman in so long. It was unsettling. I found myself sort of wanting to get annoyed at them, and then I remembered, no, I've met with them for this purpose. I can't get annoyed at them. Naturally, you sort of find yourself trying to debate with them a little bit and push back on some of the stuff, but they're just incredibly, especially the first guy I spoke to in the piece, just incredibly set in their ways on this. And there felt like every time I would suggest something, he came back with like 5 more anecdotes of a woman abusing her husband or something, or a stat about the family court that I'd say, well, I don't disagree with you that there could be issues, all kinds of things, but it just felt so radicalised to the point where there was a level to which you just can't connect.
I found your piece so compassionate. There's a lot of writing about incels and incel culture, but what I really enjoyed about your piece was how much you kind of tried to understand what it's like for these guys to live this sort of strange life and to be so radicalized and alone. I thought that was really powerful in your piece. And one of the things you wanted to find was somebody who was kind of in the process of being dragged down into this kind of the process of being radicalized, basically, in the manosphere or into the incel movement. What does that radicalization look like? Can you talk about that a little bit?
So one of the guys I spoke to was 18, and he was much less radical than the first guy I spoke to, who was very hardline. I felt like I simply couldn't change his mind at all. And he was kind of flip-flopping a lot in the conversation, and he would, he was the one that called women whores, and he really would get annoyed about women wearing bikinis, and he'd think that women were choosing the wrong kind of guys and not choosing him, and how he was he called himself a gentleman. And I thought, you've just called women whores, but
not very sure.
But he didn't feel at all as hardline. I felt like he said that it gave him a lot of comfort going on because he was living alone at that point. He'd just left school and was living alone and working in a sort of computer-y job, but he really, really wasn't speaking to anyone. He felt very isolated. And I felt when I pushed back more, he was much more amenable and would kind of change. He just didn't really feel like he'd figured it all out. But he was, on these forums where people were telling him, listen, the problems in your life are women. These are women. Men are actually oppressed for being men. Like, it's, women who aren't sleeping with you or who are, not treating you as you want to be treated. They're the problem. And I felt like he did buy into it and he was reflecting that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, he seemed much more amenable. And he texted me after I left saying, sorry, I don't mean all women are whores. And I thought, well, it's not okay. So some are, I guess. But I felt like you obviously know that that's not what you're supposed to be saying. And you know that was a weird thing to say. I felt like he is someone whose mind could be changed if you spent enough time with him. Like, if he hung out with women more and his life got a bit better, I didn't feel like he was set in stone on it. But I felt like his most supportive community right now was coming from a bunch of men telling him he's oppressed for being a man, as opposed to the other actual problems in his life.
You spent a long time reporting this piece. Just to give our listeners a sense, were you in touch with these guys for a long time? Did you met them once? Was it difficult to meet them? Just give us a bit of a sense of that behind the scenes stuff.
Well, it took me ages to find them because you have to message. I was messaging them on Reddit, and I kept getting banned from Reddit because I messaged like 50 people in one go, and most of them were American or didn't want to speak to me. But then I found them on different forums. So I called all of them first to sort of sound out what they were like. And I was actually kind of surprised how up for speaking they were, because you think you might not want to. Obviously, I promised them I wouldn't put their names in. I think a lot of them just really felt the need to be heard. They really want, they've got this grievance. People aren't listening. They want to be listened to. But on the phone it was fine. I was a bit nervous meeting in person. We sort of agreed lunch places for all of them, or I went one in the afternoon. But I was quite nervous, obviously, because these people who really talk about misogyny online and how women are the problem, and I'm meeting up with someone who, well, Alex definitely believed I was he definitely had this conception of me in his head as an angry feminist, and I was a bit worried. And then meeting them, but then you meet them and in your head you're like, these people who've been said quite aggressive things online, and I was just, in my head I was thinking about Alex's name being feminist or the gender KKK, and thinking about the more quite strong stuff he'd said. And then I meet him, and he's this quite mild person at a train station who is quite friendly, and I, faintly embarrassed by the whole thing. And when he warmed to a theme, he'd get quite loud and he'd go back into his more radical mode. But you meet them and you're like, oh, you are a real person and you are just a bit lonely.
Yeah. I mean, so lying behind all of this work that you've done, trying to kind of understand these few men who are perhaps on a path of radicalization, sort of misogynistic radicalization, lying behind all of that is a context of really prevalent violence against women in this country, in the UK and around the world. And there are, of course, there are notable incidents where this kind of manosphere, this online misogyny has spilled over, if you will, into the real world, in quote marks. Of course, the online world is very, very real, and we all experience it as a key part of our lives. So, but this, as you say, this kind of statements, misogynistic statements, worldviews about women do lead some people to real violence and real action. And that is, that must for you have been in your mind when you met them. But I think one of the challenging ideas in looking at this theme, and that you were trying to explore, is, okay, well, how do we kind of bring men back from this online radicalization? You've identified the loneliness and perhaps lack of support systems as creating vulnerabilities that maybe make men more likely to fall into what we were calling the incel trap in this piece. But it is a challenging idea to say, well, actually, look, there's this really prevalent violence against women, but we need to seek out empathy and sympathy with the people who, some of whom end up being perpetrators violence and actually, ending women's lives, murdering women. Like, we can't ignore that. That's quite a tricky conversation to have, isn't it? How do you find space for a de-radicalization path without losing sight of the women who are the victims of some of these men?
Definitely. And it's all very well for me to say, oh, you've just got to befriend them, but I just had lunch with them. I'm not, we're not hanging out now. So I don't know who are the women who are supposed to fight through those views and do that. I wouldn't want to insist anyone has to do that. So it's really difficult. You do have a weird feeling when you're speaking to these people to think, you feel this sort of feeling of, God, you really don't like a big part of me. I don't think there has been a proven successful, like always working de-radicalization incel path. What has been good is apparently there's systems where women do a sort of coaching for these men, sort of job, like it's a paid for, speaking to these men, sort of dating coaching. That apparently is useful for making them just relax more around women, view women more as people. And I think, I spoke to William Costello, an academic, and he said this does actually work for the most people who really define as incels. When they speak to women who coach them into it, they can relax a bit and it does help. But, you know, that's not going to work for everyone. And dating, you know, getting used to dating isn't the only issue. And, you know, well, they could get good at dating, but then still be deeply misogynistic. So it's not a full answer. Labour are doing, you know, talked about plans about support in school so boys don't get as indoctrinated by Andrew Tate and other sort of misogynistic YouTubers, but you have to wonder how much that will help, you know, with the huge wash of the internet. Might they just think, you know, a peer mentor at school may not help very much. So I think all those initiatives are good. I think, you know, men who are completely stuck and lonely if there was a, you know, kind of service to help them get used to speaking to women, I don't think that's a terrible thing at all, but I don't think it's going to, I think with kids are so impressionable that maybe, you know, more teaching and peer support can help. And also, I think having the words around it is also helpful for women to be able to identify what these kind of views are and that they're wrong. When I was younger, sense of feminism was just very useful in recognising when some behaviour was just outrageous. So I think it's useful on both sides to know about it and talk about it. But yeah, there is no definite answer at the moment. You know, it's very correlated with bad mental health. So, you know, good access to therapy will definitely help and definitely help people get out of the sort of the darkest holes. It would definitely help. But yeah, there's not a straightforward answer to how to fix it.
I mean, I'm sure it's slightly more complicated than this, but do you, after all of your research, basically understand this misogyny, particularly among young men, as a manifestation of the mental health crisis? Would you subscribe to that view?
I mean, in some ways, yeah, because I could see the men I spoke to obviously had poor mental health, like very, very obviously unhappy. So yeah, but then on the other hand, I know a lot of people who have poor mental health who are not like that. So it's not the only route that you have to go down. And I think it's like the idea that just, if they were happy, they'd just forgive women for all the wrongs they think women have done to them. I don't fully buy in. I'm sort of 50-50 on it because I definitely think mental health is very, very obviously a factor. But on the other hand, I think sort of their natural like outsideriness makes them choose that part of the internet. It's a decision to channel that all that unhappiness into a very, very specific subject, and there's a sort of level of anger. Yeah. So I don't think it fully is, but I definitely think it's part of it.
Obviously, misogyny has existed at times when the challenges of mental health have been very different, and the levels of, you know, mental illness, depression, of anxieties may have looked very, very different. So totally. Sorry.
When there was no internet, right?
Well,
but
totally.
you know, yeah, there's the elephant in the room, or not so much elephant in the room, is just, you know, broader social inequalities. You could get only so far, but the attitude would probably still be there somehow, even if some of these men were feeling a bit better about their lives. So, Emily, what most surprised you in your reporting?
I was surprised that incel violence is relatively low, most studies show, which did surprise me because there's some very high-profile cases of violence. It's low compared to other radical groups, which did surprise me because obviously incel violence does exist, and, you know, Elliot Rodger's most famous mass shooting, but there have been very clear cases of it. But in general, the academic William Costello told me that it's because the internet sort of reduces they channel all their rage into the internet as opposed to in real life. They're so focused on online world, they're not as busy committing violence in the outside world. However, obviously, you know, the counterpoint to that is lots and lots and lots of violence against women happens. It's not all perpetrated by incels. So it's actually a more common thing. It's much more common than that. Incels are a tiny, tiny fraction of that.
Thank you so much, Emily, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of Tory Party conference.
Thank you. I will.
So, Ellen, we just spoke with our colleague, Emily, Prospects Commissioning Editor, about her piece from the magazine, The Incel Trap, which she spent a year or so reporting and writing. What did you think of our conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so having seen Emily go through this process to report out this piece, I think it's been a really interesting project. And I think the question I asked her, finding the way through between compassion for an understanding of lonely, isolated men, and kind of trying to understand that as a partial, or at least part of their journey into radicalization and misogyny, and finding a way between that and talking properly, giving space to the women who end up being the victims or the targets of their hatred, I think is really is like one of the key challenges basically in this whole space. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think Emily did approach that really sensitively. The point from William Costello about the likelihood of men who express these views actually kind of perpetrating acts of violence. I mean, I feel like I need to know more about that to be sort of convinced that that's a sort of useful way of understanding this issue really in this area, because we know that, yes, misogyny is, pretty widespread. We see more and more kind of prominent public figures, particularly on the internet, who legitimize quite abhorrent views about women and misogyny. And I just wonder, like, if there's like some data point being made about the likelihood of perpetrating violence, who is being included in these groups? Are we talking about, like, is it like an act of violence per like misogynist? Like, I just would be interested in the sort of methodology behind that kind of data piece. So I think for me, there's a lot more that I'd love to understand about that. But I think what Emily did really well in this piece and explained really kind of eloquently as well is this loneliness. And she definitely found a way of connecting with these individuals who express views about her as a woman and all of us as women that are really, really difficult. So I think it opens up a conversation about how you bring people back from this increasingly common, I think, path of misogyny and hatred of women.
It's really interesting what you said about the data, I think, and the rates of violence. So just unpacking that a little bit, if you compared to so the other extreme groups really are the far right and kind of Islamist extremists, probably broadly in the UK anyway. In those cases, I guess you also have like lone wolf attacks, like Elliot Rodgers. One person goes out and kind of kills a lot of people in the name of a particular belief. But I think for those groups, you have kind of more leader figures that are kind of, certainly on the Islamist extremist side, you have more kind of organization. You have more kind of like support for carrying out stuff that's kind of organized, or maybe even groups of people doing stuff together. And maybe that's increasingly happening on the far right as well. I don't think that among incels that's really the case. It's kind of a headless thing. I mean, there are people like Andrew Tate who make lots of videos saying, yeah, women are awful and like, rape is justified and stuff like that. But they're not kind of organized. So I think that will be one of the reasons. I guess the other reason would be, so you still get those kind of lone wolves going out, like in places like America and Canada, particularly, right, where it's really easy to get hold of it's really easy to get hold of a weapon, and then they kind of go out and kind of actualize this hatred. But I think, so that's one thing. The other thing, I guess, is also that most, like, you talked about the general trend of violence against women, which is so high and everywhere all over the world. The people who are most likely to commit that violence are intimate partners, right? Intimate partner violence is sort of the most common type of violence. Or if you're within family or intimate partner, and incels don't have partners. So I guess part of the reason that kind of attitude that might come out in a relationship for them is not coming out in that context, but in really extreme cases, they're going out and like, shooting women in the street and killing them, right? So I think it's almost like the fact that they are less likely to commit violence, it kind of says something a bit backwards about violence against women, because really the trend of violence against women is not about incels. Incels are like a function of misogyny more broadly, and a really weird one that's kind of played out on the internet. So I think I can understand, that data makes sense to me, but it doesn't mean that the movement is less dangerous, because you still get, it doesn't matter how few of them, you still get guys who are willing to pick up a gun and go and kill women because they're so frustrated and they hate women.
It's such a small part of the overall story about violence against women. And we, obviously when incels perpetrate violence, you hear about it now. But no, that's such an important point about partner violence. Yeah, totally.
I thought it was really interesting to hear what it was like for Emily to meet these guys. I think as much as about incels, this is a story about how, like, the way that we treat each other online, the way we talk to each other online is so far removed from what we do in real life. It's a bit like driving, right? You're driving in a car and all the other cars are like, people treat them like as if they're their enemies and they hate them. They scream at people in other cars. It's really, really horrible to each other. It's the same on the internet. And when Emily met these guys in person, they're like, some of them are kind of apologizing for saying something offensive, texting her later to say, I'm really sorry that I said that thing, but, I didn't mean not you, other women, kind of thing. In real life, these things often fall flat when you meet somebody that you in theory hate, whether they're like an immigrant or a woman or whoever, then, actually they're just a human being. And you kind of I think you realize that quite quickly. And all these things that you've built up, the person has built up, their kind of worldview sort of falls apart as soon as they meet a real live woman. So I thought that was really interesting. It's kind of it's bigger than incels. It's about how we speak to each other online and what happens when people actually meet in real life.
Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for with this week's episode. Thanks so much to Emily for joining us, and thanks to our listeners at home for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, head to our website at prospectmagazine.co.uk or to our app, where you can find all of the brilliant features from the latest issue of our magazine, including Emily's piece, The Incel Trap, a US election culture special, and much more. Thanks for joining.